welcome to today's panel. As Bill already spoke about in his speech, carbon farming, which is the topic of this panel, is handled as the most important, or at least one of the most important measures to extract carbon from the atmosphere and store it in soil and vegetation, so mainly agricultural grounds and forests. And if this is what we're talking about here, carbon farming is quite a wide term. And we really want to put the focus, we're going to talk about many different aspects, but one of the focuses that we want to set is carbon farming in terms of agricultural measures. So we're talking crop diversification was already something that was named, cover crops, rotating crops, agroforestry, all these measures take place on an agricultural level. And if they're done well and correctly, they do have obviously the benefit of reducing our carbon footprint, but also have other co-benefits, as Bill already mentioned as well. Protecting the ground from wind erosion, for example, or enabling the ground to absorb water better. All of these things are quite important to our climate. So we're going to talk about all of these different aspects today, and I'm just going to introduce my panelists that join me here on stage today. We have the lead head of unit for land economy and carbon removals at the Directorate General Climate Action for the European Commission, Christian Holzleitner.
Yeah, hi.
Next, we have the CEO of the climate tech startup Ocel. You are developing data-driven carbon credits. Welcome, Christian Decher.
Hello.
And last but certainly not least, we have the business development lead for the carbon venture EMEA at the Regenerative Agriculture and Sustainability Department at Bayer. Welcome so much, Thales Conde-Pires.
Thank you.
Perfect. Let's get right into it and maybe start with a bit more of an overarching topic, which is why, Christian Holzleitner, our first question goes to you from a European Commission perspective. Would you say that carbon farming is the right tool for us to tackle our carbon footprint? And if so, what can be done to set positive incentives for growers on the one hand, but also big corporations, which are quite important drivers in the value chain as well, to engage in carbon farming?
Yeah, we have one big objective in European climate politics, and this is to make Europe climate neutral in 2050. So this means, in the first place, we have to reduce our emissions very quickly, very significantly. And with the rollout of renewables, we are on a good way. But we'll always have emissions in the system, not least from the production of food and biomass. That's unavoidable. So we must get better at managing those emissions. We've already talked about nitrogen, the fertilizers, methane from livestock. But as good as we get, we'll always have that emission. So we also need to get better at getting the CO2 out of the atmosphere, storing it in our soils, in our forests. The products we produce of that biomass, for example, are long-lasting building materials. And then at the end, a certain share of that biogenic carbon we need to put back into the empty gas fields like of the North Sea, where we've initially taken the fossil carbon from. So we need new value chains, much more resilient value chains, sustainable value chains in 2040, 2050. And of course, for that, in the first place, we need very resilient, very sustainable forestry and agriculture in 2050. Because we'll even that probably need more from our land than today, because we need carbon as a feedstock for buildings, chemicals, textiles. So I'm very much into not only agriculture, but all the other startups that I'm seeing downstairs. And so we need to help the whole value chain in that transformation to a more sustainable business model. And what we've seen with the farmers, with the protests over the last years, they are not happy. They want to be more recognized for that. And this is why we are working on the certification for carbon farming, so that we can give the farmers, the foresters, better information at hand, better advice, how they can manage more sustainably their land. And then to document that and to be able to reward it. Because now, if someone wants to invest into this, they are never really sure. There are all the claims about greenwashing and so on. And that we want to improve, and we want to have positive incentives for farmers and foresters. And once we manage that, once we can really measure, so value these benefits that more sustainable agriculture brings, then we can set the financial incentives there. Currently, we are looking a lot on voluntary carbon markets, but it's also the public financing through the common agricultural policy, or in the future developing compliance markets, sustainability standards for the supply chain, or for the whole supply chain, because I think we shouldn't just have a focus on the farmers and foresters. As also said before, we need to look, okay, who's producing the pesticides, the fertilizers, all the inputs we need. And then we need the other value chains. If we change our diets a bit, we need to change the value chain. And if we want to have more biogenic carbon for chemicals, for building materials, this also needs a change in the processing industry. So we need to work with the whole value chain. But I think at the heart, there must be better incentives for the farmers and foresters that are the stewards of our nature that we need so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point that you made, and that was already spoken about earlier, around it being a value chain play and an ecosystem play, I think is quite important, right? I think everyone, and I see that as well, every player of the value chain is trying to engage in this ecosystem play. But I think because from the past, it's not really, it doesn't come natural to every player. I think it's a little bit of a struggle, but I think this is the challenge that we have to overcome along the value chain. And if we're there, then I think that will become much easier, so that the risk and all the kind of problems of implementation aren't just set with the grower.
And I think to add, we really need a holistic view. We need to foster those practices that are good for climate, that are good for resilience, and that are good for biodiversity.
Right.
This all goes together. And if we look at the rewetting of peatlands or agroforestry, these practices tick a lot of boxes.
Yeah, for sure. Christian Decher, would you agree? Do you think, right, carbon farming is the right tool? And how would you react to the challenge that is often kind of brought up around carbon farming when it comes to the permanence or the reduced permanence of storing carbon in agricultural grounds or forests compared to moors, for example? Should we rather focus on renaturating moors? How do you see that?
So I would say in general that I really don't enjoy this competition among different sorts of carbon removals. I think looking at the scale of the problem that we are facing, and I mean, Christian already touched on this, so even if we do a great job in avoiding and reducing emissions, we will be left with a lot of emissions. Call them hard to abate, call them residual emissions, however you want to call them. So looking into, especially the next 10 to 20 years, I think we should be very happy about every single potential solution that we have. And that's why we really support solutions, especially in carbon farming and so on. And I think there's one, so touching on this topic of permanence you mentioned, I think there's still one major misconception around permanence. So of course, if you emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, then most of this will remain in the atmosphere for around 300 years. So it wouldn't be fair if you remove something with a carbon credit and then you only store it for, let's say, 5 years or 10 years, right? It wouldn't be fair to the climate. But we really have to understand that we can not only work with removals that can give us a 300-year permanence so that you do 1 ton for 300 years. We have this option, and this is so important, that we can do, for example, 10 tons for 30 years each, right? It's the same effect. And now, why is this option so important? Because permanence is only one side to the problem. And the other side to the problem is scale. And when I mean scale today. Like, what are the technologies that we can really scale today? And for example, direct air capture, really good at permanence, but sorry to say, really crappy at scale. So especially in the next 10 to 20 years. And for example, if we look at agricultural projects, they are really good at scale. We have so much agricultural lands, but they are really not this amazing in permanence. And when we want to optimize and say, all right, which technology or which climate project type really maximizes both permanence as well as scale, that's where really the magic of forests come into play. So when you look at forests, they can do up to 30 years or sometimes even more in permanence, which is, let's say, 1/10 of what a direct air capture can do. But if we look at the land cover, so for example, around 40% of the EU is covered by forests. Well, if we look globally, it's about 1/3 of the land mass. So when it comes to scale, we can do 100,000 times the scale of direct air capture pretty much with immediate impact, like today. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, not to nitpick the kind of carbon storage measures based on either permanence or scale, but you need to look at both. I think that's a
Yeah,
really important point.
and maybe just to add this, so when I say forest, a lot of people think of forest like, okay, so you do afforestation, you plant trees, or you do REDD+, you avoid deforestation. So neither afforestation nor avoiding deforestation plays a major role within Europe, because in Europe we have rarely any deforestation. It's very rare, right? It's globally it's a big issue, but not so much in Europe. And if we look at only planting trees, just a very minor proportion of the land is being planted. So it's very good that we do this as well. But the majority of the forest is already existing forests. And 97% of the forests in Europe are being professionally managed. And you can imagine, I mean, if you drive down the highway and you look at the forest and you think, okay, all of the trees are like perfect straight, they have no branches, and it's like the same species all over. Do you think this is an accident? Do you think this was growing naturally? Of course not, right? So this forest is professionally managed, and it's managed to produce timber, to produce wood products. So what we do at OCell is we change the perspective of the management, and we say, okay, with carbon credits, we have this amazing tool so that we can put a financial incentive on, for example, biodiversity, carbon storage, but also climate resilience. But we need this tool, like this financial incentive, to change the management. And when we do this, we can do gigaton scale with immediate impact and up to 30-year permanence, right? So let's get the framework right so that people understand that permanence is important, but scale is equally important.
Yeah, agreed. Great. Thales, question to you. Again, carbon farming, right tool, and also we already heard from Bill earlier, obviously pesticides and fertilizers are currently part of Bayer's business model. How do you currently manage that paradigm shift within Bayer, and what is your view on that?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for the fair question. I think Bill did a very good introduction to it. I think we are past the point to discuss if carbon farming is worth or not. We are way past the point to take action. So I don't think it's even worth discussing that too much. I think we need to broaden up the discussion in the sense that we need to restore nature. We need to go way beyond carbon. We need to have a landscape view to these farms and to the farm's livelihood, so we actually deploy the right tools to support them transitioning, right? Now, talking about Bayer, and I don't want to repeat anything that was already said, but I think the way that Bayer sees and the way that we see our business also is a little bit more holistically than only an input provider. We are saying that climate change has very serious effects, and one of the individuals suffering the most around are the growers, right? Every day that a grower wakes up, he relies on the weather, he relies on climate to perform his basic activities. And we are now seeing droughts, floods, new pests, and everything in extremes happening on these farms, meaning that the growers are suffering on a daily basis. And the way that we see our business is not, again, as an input provider. We see our business as someone that should be helping growers. Our business is the grower. Our business are not crop protection and seeds. So we need to look beyond that. We need to find the right tools to actually support growers. And again, bringing it more holistically, we are talking about food security. We are talking about the textile industry. We are talking about the energy industry. So we are talking about something that is not only Bayer's accountability, but everyone on the value chain. And I really like that you brought the grower perspective and the value chain perspective, because that's it, right? And finally, I think we are also talking about new value pools. We are out there to try to create new market opportunities for growers, to tap into new value pools, to tap into new revenue streams. And that will also impact us as a company, not only because we are securing our core business, but because we are creating new opportunities for growers, and by extent by ourselves and for all the other companies in the value chain. And this even goes to other sectors around us, right? So that's my take to initialize the discussion here.
Yeah. And I think that that's quite an important point. And I think when we're talking about the ecosystem play in the value chain, I think this idea around tapping into new value streams and making it commercially worthwhile, obviously for the corporations in the value chain, but also for the growers. I think that's quite an important thing, and that we're going to come back to that later. Maybe Christian Häusleitner talking again, taking the grower's perspective on this. We do know, or at least that's a fact that should be factored in here, when growers first adopt carbon farming practices, most of the time their crop yield goes down in the first years, at least for the first year or two that they do this. Where do you think this risk should be sitting? Should it be sitting with the grower? Should it be sitting alone with them? And if not, how can we make an effort to spread that risk across the value chain better?
Yeah, I think like in other sectors, these are big investments, and you'll have a bigger effect, of course, the bigger the land use change that you were going through. Like for example, the rewetting of peatlands, setting aside areas for agroforestry, and then as a farmer, you want to be sure that this income stream is not changing from year to year, but it's there maybe until 2050, and you have a clear perspective where this is going, and you have a commitment both from the public policymakers, but also within the value chain, that this is for good. And farmers are very wary about that. One decade we tell them, you should drain your peatlands. The other decade we tell them, you should re-wet it. And so we really need to build trust on that. And I think that's the discussion that we are now also having in Brussels. We had the strategic dialogue on agriculture, where I think we've come to a conclusion. How do we want to go forward? How do we want to have this more sustainable model of European agriculture? And so we need to discuss the mix between, okay, what do we do with the common agricultural policy versus what, as I said, what can we finance within the value chain and what could be financed possibly outside the value chain with a voluntary carbon market, for example. And so you could see models where like these initial investments are taken over by public money. So there could be an option to see more the common agricultural policy going towards investment support. Other things, what you see currently, like on carbon markets, are forward contracts. So you could say, okay, I want from you carbon removal emission reductions in 5 years as a company, but I know there will be a bit of competition for that. So I'll already pay you now against delivery in 5 years, for example. And there could be many ways on how then the public sector could also come in, guarantee such contracts. And this is something we want to look into. How can we find there the best mix of financial incentives? But like these forward contracts are a feature that you see like with direct air capture.
Yeah.
A lot. So as I said, we're working on both levels. We need to get the certification right. We need to know what is happening there, and then look at different financial models.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Talking about the certification and maybe in general the voluntary carbon market, Christian Decher, what do you think are the most important enabling kind of factors and kind of the framework that is needed in order to stabilize that market?
Yeah, so what we need is really clarity for the buyers of credits. What can they do with the credit? So for example, Christian, with the EU, introduced this concept of the permanent and the temporary credits, and we really support it. I think it's a great concept. But what needs to be clear is, how can I, as a company, account these credits? So for example, one of the issues we are always approached with is this very famous topic of double counting. So sustainability managers approach us and they ask us, so when I buy a credit from carbon farming or from forestry, then this is already accounted for in the national inventory, right? They do this LULUCF accounting. So I cannot account this credit in my own balance sheet. And we keep telling, well, that you need to get the bigger picture. This is not really the case. But I would be very keen on hearing your opinion on this, Christian. How do you see this from the EU perspective?
Yeah, that was a question. So maybe let's get to that right now. From a carbon accounting perspective, and Christian Decher already spoke about it just now. Double accounting and double counting is obviously quite a challenge. Is there an EU perspective around that, and should there maybe be a bit more of a generic guidance and like almost regulation around standardizing this to avoid double counting?
So now it's getting quite nerdy on this thing. So there are two levels of accounting. You account at the level of the company, and you account at the level of the nations that are part of the Paris Agreement. And of course, you don't want to have any emission reductions or carbon removals accounted in two national accounts. You don't want to have them accounted for the farmer or then for the food processors who has bought that credit. And that's the important thing. You cannot count it twice in one of these two layers. And that's the current legal situation. Like it's everywhere. I mean, if you decide to invest into a TV set that consumes less energy, you see it yourself, and you see it at the national account. So no problem there. That's the current legal situation. But then some in the voluntary carbon market say, okay, we want to go a step further, and so we don't want to buy credits that are not accounted. We only want to buy credits that are not accounted in a national account. This is mixing up the two things, and then everyone gets very, very confused. And personally, I'm not sure whether this is a good approach, and adds a lot of credibility there. But it is an ongoing discussion. We still need to negotiate the Green Claims Directive that, for example, should set the rules for European consumers, or which claims you can make towards European consumers. We need this final negotiation between Parliament and our member states that should happen in the first half of 25, so that can bring more clarity. We are also constantly working on the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is an important place for companies that are now mandated to do this if they have climate claims, to do it according to these rules. So there are places where we can develop that further. But what I also think is, if we think towards what we should do after 2030, towards 2050, I think we'll need to think more about compliance market standards, because the challenge that we have, I don't think that this can be solved just with the voluntary carbon market, which currently is not in the best place.
Yeah. So there is some more work to be done there, for sure. Yeah. Thales, maybe from your perspective, and I know you take a bit more of a within the value chain perspective and maybe even grower perspective, what are the biggest roadblocks that you see at the moment for employing carbon practices across a broad spectrum? And what role does potentially regulation play in that as well?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of challenges, and this is our day-to-day life, but let me try to block into the three main ones that we see, right? The first one is measurements, and I think we were talking in the morning about how much we are investing to get the best models, the best remote sensing, to get something that is science-based, because that is the key word here. We cannot have an approach that is fluffy, and measuring carbon on the soil, it is not the easiest thing ever, right? But you also need to come up with a solution that is economically viable to everyone, right? So I think this is the first one, but I think this is one of the challenges that we have been evolving a lot, and I see that we are taking huge leaps forward, right? The second one, going a little bit more towards your second question, or your second half of the question on the regulation. For me, there is a mixed feeling over there. First of all, there is the current state of regulations, and there is the potential that regulations can bring us to establish the market. And let me put it in a little bit in a broader way, because it's not only regulations, but we are also talking about the voluntary market. So we also have certification bodies, and we have corporate accounting directives that we need to follow. So we have here the EUDR, the CSRD, the CRCF, we have VM0042, we have Greenhouse Protocol, SBTi, and I bored you with only a few of those. And every day, we are so locked up in rooms, just reading through thousands of pages. And where it gets dangerous for us is that it's okay to have all of these rules, but it needs to reflect a market reality, agricultural market reality. And most importantly, it needs to be something that we can actually put on a farm. Because if we are just in rooms discussing, and that is not applicable to a farm, it is all in vain, right? So that's where we are at, and that's where we struggle a little bit. But there is we see a light at the end of the tunnel, in the sense that there are two to three things that we believe that regulation can bring us. First of all, I think you mentioned is the standardization and putting a floor to solutions. Unfortunately, we have seen solutions in the market that didn't come up with the quality that we think they should have. And we cannot afford, again, to have solutions that are not science-based, that edge greenwash, or that have fluffy claims, right? And I think regulation has this potential. Secondly, regulation does have the potential to reduce complexity instead of increasing complexity. And I really like the work that you guys are doing at the CRCF, because it is going down that road, because you guys are talking to a lot of stakeholders. And we see that you're trying to reduce the complexity and establish that, right? And the last one is regulation has the potential to incentivize players that should be taking action, but they are not so far. And sometimes it's the carrot, sometimes they stick, right? And I think regulation can bring the stick. But let me just go through the third challenge and the third roadblock, which for me is the most important one, and is the one that we should be spending more time on, which is grower engagements and practical impacts on farms. We are talking about a sector that is extremely fragmented, millions of growers. We are talking about a sector that works on low margins, and it's even the livelihood, the basic livelihoods of so many people around. And you have growers that have been doing the same thing for generations. So you're not only changing the way that they do business, you're changing the way that they behave towards their family, the way they behave towards their community. Instead of establishing a seasonal contract to sell a commodity, you're asking them to sign a 20-year contract, sometimes 30-year contract, that they don't even have visibility of what is the data that we are requesting? What are the responsibilities? What are they legally binded to X or Z in these contracts, right? So there is so much. And again, I wish we were spending more time at the farms than in rooms, because that is where we need to be. And I think we need to figure this out with the growers. And we need, again, I would just make a call to action. We need to take action now. We need to stop talking and take action with the growers. We need to be there, right? And we need to have the right tools and incentives for them.
Yeah, I could not agree more with pretty much everything you just said, but specifically also that last point, because that's what we see a lot of the times with the companies that are further up the value chain, closer to the end consumer. Their main challenge is to build that bridge to the grower. And their main challenge in tackling any of these like climate change challenges is to bridge that gap between them and like going beyond all of these in between parties. And I think that that's quite an important point, to take that view more often. Also from a regulatory perspective, I do think it obviously does add a lot of pressure and a lot of complexity to corporations at the moment. There's a lot coming down the pike that corporations need to deal with, that growers need to deal with. But it has the wonderful effect that it gets everyone on their feet and actually gets the journey started. And unfortunately, a lot of the times that seems to be necessary. Otherwise, not enough things happen in an appropriate amount of time. So speaking of time, actually, I'm having red numbers flashing towards me. Maybe stopping with a final, which I think quite an important question, because we're now, again, going back to the farm, taking the grower perspective. Thales, what's your view around making this commercially worthwhile for them? I do think that's really quite an important closing note. How can we make this commercially worthwhile for a grower?
Yeah. So again, we are talking about food security. We are talking about livelihoods, and we are talking about the long-term future of not only our company, but everyone in this room. So first of all, it needs to be not only a value chain effort, but we need the NGOs to oversee the work that we are doing. We need governments to come through with it. And we need organizations to actually stop talking and really acting, right? And to make it worth for the growers, you need to be there to listen to them, and you need to understand their activity. And it's just not by expecting that they're going to do this work because everyone is telling them to. You need to show them the way. You need to decomplify everything that you're saying, right? And you need to provide them with the right tools. So again, I think to make it worthwhile for growers, we need to create the opportunities as a market, and we need to provide them with the right tools to make it easier. You cannot just ask a grower to give you 100 new data points. You need to be there on the journey with them. You need to understand the decisions that they make on their everyday life. So when they harvest, which cover crop mix is important for that specific farm, not for an entire country, right? So let's get specific with the growers, not get specific with all these small letters in the other sides of the business, right? So that is what I think will make it worth. Understanding the grower needs, understanding their struggle right now, and understanding that each grower has a different challenge facing on their farm, and we need to be there to listen to them and really provide them with the right solutions.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I could be talking about this for many more hours. It's a very important topic. Unfortunately, we are at time, but thank you so much for your takes on this. Thank you so much for your attention. And unfortunately, we have to conclude this panel now, but I think it was a really good discussion.